I'm Taylor Riggs, and for Emily Chang in San Francisco, this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Twitter upstages Facebook. CEO Jack Dorsey says Twitter will ban all political ads, and this is as Facebook sticks its policy to run ads, citing free speech. Plus, you can't mention Facebook without hearkening back to the Cambridge Analytica user data scandal of 2018. We hear from a central figure from that period. It's whistleblower Brittany Kaiser from the Sooner Than You Think Tech Conference in New York. And Tesla owners, they are talking. Part 2 of Bloomberg's expansive study of thousands of Model 3 owners. Today, we examine whether parts and services are up to snuff. But first, to our top story. So on Wednesday, Twitter announced that it will stop all political ads on its platform, with CEO Jack Dorsey saying this isn't about free speech, this is about paying for reach. And that sentiment was not echoed by Facebook as they reported earnings and reassured their stance when it comes to political ads. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg stayed on brand during the earnings call.
I expect that this is going to be a very tough year. We try to do what we think is right, but we're not going to get everything right. This is complex stuff, and anyone who says that the answers are simple hasn't thought long enough about all the nuances and downstream challenges. Now, I get that some people are going to disagree with our decisions. I get that some people are going to think that these decisions may have a negative impact on things that they really care about. But I don't think anyone can say that we're not doing what we believe, or that we haven't thought hard about these issues.
Bloomberg opinion Shira Ovide joins me now to discuss that. Shira, how much more pressure is Mark Zuckerberg under today than he was 2 days ago?
Well, I mean, he was already under some considerable pressure, right? If you have people like Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez all piling on, criticizing Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook for their policy about political advertising and political speech on Facebook. I'm not sure Jack Dorsey really tips the scales that much more, but certainly what Jack Dorsey and Twitter did on Wednesday, it takes away one of Mark Zuckerberg's arguments, right? That his peers at Twitter and Google are all doing the same thing when it comes to political advertising, and Dorsey basically said, nope, we're not.
Shira, at 0.5% of revenue, which is the political ad contribution to Facebook, why even get in this controversy to begin with?
I think that's a great question, and certainly that is a point that many people have made, that Facebook would not be giving up really that much revenue if it decided we're just going to stop taking political ads and just take ourselves out of this part of the conversation. I think the argument that Mark Zuckerberg is making, and you can say it's the wrong decision, but it does feel like he really believes it, is that Facebook doesn't want to be in a position where they're asked to censor political speech. Right. And he really sees this as kind of a free speech argument. And there's certainly a lot of people, particularly conservative politicians, who agree with him. And it does feel like a principled stand rather than a stand that is motivated entirely by money.
Shira, if Facebook has 0.5%, I was hearing statistics thrown around that Twitter then has 0.05% of their revenue coming from political ads. So why their decision to weigh in here?
Yeah, look, for Twitter, it's a little bit of an easier decision to say, we're going to stop taking candidate ads. We're going to stop taking ads that are related to sort of hot button issues like healthcare or abortion or taxes, because those kinds of advertisements are a teeny fraction of a company that is already a fraction of the size of Facebook. So Twitter has never been a place that was either large enough or where the ads are targeted enough to be appealing for political related advertising. And so Dorsey, look, give him credit for taking a position and sticking to it. But it's also true that it's a little bit easier to take that kind of stand when the advertising that he's talking about is relatively insignificant for Twitter.
Sherry, you write a Bloomberg opinion column and you get hundreds of comments and emails coming in. Using that as a sample data, who is right here?
I don't think my email comments are necessarily representative, but I do feel like the Facebook is in this cycle where nothing they do is right. And there's a little bit of unfairness to that, but it's also true that, look, they're a place that has an audience of a couple billion people plus on a daily basis, and the choices they make have an extremely large impact both on what people see, who gets seen, whose voice gets heard, and that's why there's so much attention on the policy choices that Facebook makes and on how they write their algorithms, that the choices of one company controlled almost entirely by one man are so important in the discourse of the country and the world.
Shira, you write a very obvious question that I had failed to ask up until this point, which was, how did Google manage to stay out of all of this?
I don't know. To me, this is one of the great mysteries of online advertising controversies the last few years, is that Google has sort of managed to stay out of the fray. So Google is the largest advertising seller in the world, and they somehow, while Mark Zuckerberg has taken these principled stands on free speech and gotten criticized by everybody from the president on down for how they handle political candidates and their advertisements on Facebook, Google has said nothing, that as far as I can see, and they haven't really been called to account. I can't imagine it will stay that way, but so far they have just kind of let Mark Zuckerberg take the fire.
Well, Shira Ovide is going to be sticking with us because I want to jump over to another big tech giant that has been reporting, and that was Apple yesterday. And Apple has created new ways to juice up those iPhone sales. So on an earnings call, executives put aside their typical praise of the device's design and technology, and instead they talked about installment plans, trade-in programs, and giveaways. iPhone sales fell in the latest quarter, but overall revenue rose. So Bloomberg Technology's Ian King joins me with more, and Shira Ovide will stay with us. So Ian, how are they doing this, sort of juicing up sales, if you will, via other products and other plans?
Yeah, I mean, in a world where iPhone sales, revenue from iPhones is going down sort of 9%, the fact that they're growing overall when their largest product isn't as hot as it used to be, clearly they're doing something right. So that's services, that's all of the other things that they sell, basically. People are out there buying Apple Watches, people are out there paying them for, online services and buying apps off them. And if they can continue to do that, if they can continue to keep things moving forward, then the question is, well, why do investors care? Why wouldn't they just get behind this?
Ian, what was the plan that stood out to you the most? Is it trading in phones for values? Is it hooking on Apple TV if you buy a new device? Which one did executives on the call feel was the most significant to boosting that extra revenue?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think the answer is Cook was basically asked this, what are you going to do? What's your strategy here? And it was more a case of, we're going to be flexible. We're going to do what it takes. We're going to do things in a region-specific way. He talked about what they're doing in China, adding installment plans, adding trade-ins was helping them there. Price sensitivity was their way of saying we're not going to charge as much money for the prices. Basically, he expressed a much more flexible approach than perhaps we've seen from in the past, where they've talked about this sort of supremacy of their products and the value of what they offer in terms of the actual physical entity. Very, very flexible, and obviously to an extent that's working.
Shira, your take on this new flexibility, if you will, of Apple?
I think it's absolutely smart of them. And I think I've compared this before to sort of Apple's like a duck, where from the top, from the surface, it looks all placid and calm, but underneath they're having to kick like crazy in order to stay afloat and keep gliding. So this is a company that's just going to have to work a lot harder to grow at rates that would have been really disappointing 2 or 3 years ago. So what they're doing with installment plans, with basically effective discounts on a lot of their products through things like very generous trade-ins of older devices and things like that, it makes all the sense in the world. They could get even more aggressive on price if what they're really interested in is getting devices into the hands of more people, newer devices in the hands of more people, and then trying to sell them on things like music subscriptions and more apps and video games and things like that. I'm very curious to see when Apple TV Plus launches on Friday, how Apple is going to promote that to the billion people or so who own iPhones and other Apple devices.
Well, and you heard about that Apple TV, Ian, and it's sort of tricky, right? Because if you buy a new device, you get a full year of TV. Tim Cook has said I think, just wants to get more people on the TV platform, but then we're also hooked on this new device.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly. He described it as a gift to their fan base, if you like, and talked about how wonderful the content was, and he was very coy about this. But at the same time, underpinning that was this obvious sense of practicality, of pragmatism. We want to get as many eyeballs as we can on this new content that we've spent money on. We like it, and we want them to like it. He's creating an audience now. He's not selling devices. He's basically doing audience curation, and that plays into the service model. And if you're an investor, services has almost twice the gross margin of Apple's hardware, so why wouldn't you like that?
And Shira, talk about that strategy as well with the Apple Card, because that was also a similar strategy where you have no interest on these new products. So not only are they getting people to take out or purchase or apply for an Apple Card, but then you're also getting a product.
Yeah, it's another way to effectively discount the price of a new iPhone. The Apple Card thing put it in perspective. In a place like the United States, for example, the vast majority of phones are still sold by the telephone carriers, by Verizon and AT&T and others. So what Apple is doing with things like the Apple Card discount or installment plans, those are only on Apple can best control the phones that it sells itself, and that's always going to be a fraction of the devices sold in the United States.
Bloomberg Technologies, Ian King, and Bloomberg Opinions, Shira Ovide. Thank you both for joining. Now, Pinterest stock plunged in after-hours trading on Thursday after the company reported revenue that missed analyst estimates. Shares fell as much as 20% to a level just above the company's April IPO price of $19 a share. Third quarter revenue posted at nearly $280 million, and that compared with analyst estimates of $282 million. And coming up, Bloomberg's new survey shows that while the Model 3 struggles with service, its battery is like no other. We break down all the numbers next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. It is the biggest survey of Tesla drivers ever conducted. Bloomberg polled almost 5,000 Model 3 owners with a 164-item questionnaire. And the data reveals that many of Tesla's troubles are coming from the repair shop. Here with more is David Welch, who covers Tesla for Bloomberg. So, David, point blank, is customer service improving or not?
It is, but it still has a way to go. If you look at the survey results, first off, the number of complaints has come way down as the quality of the vehicles has gotten better, but it still is taking too much time, in the opinion of customers, for Tesla to come out and make repairs to the vehicles, particularly after there's an accident. That sort of stands to reason because they've been growing sales of the Model 3 very rapidly. We even saw this with Audi more than a decade ago. They were growing sales, gangbusters in the U.S., and the dealers just couldn't get enough service base and enough service techs hired to meet all the demand for warranty work, basic repairs, and service. And in Tesla's case, they actually send people out to do some of this work. So it's really tough to keep up with that for any car company when you're growing, and Tesla's having a bit of a tough time with it. Getting better, but still not there.
And David, what is the problem? Is it a supply chain issue, or they can't train their employees fast enough to within the technology, for example? What's the real issue?
Well, it's kind of all of the above. So first of all, you have many more cars, many more owners out there, and it's just difficult for them to get enough people to service them, to get the whole infrastructure built, to get parts out in the field. That's one part of being a big car company that really gives companies like General Motors or Toyota or Volkswagen an advantage over a company like Tesla that's really the new upstart, right? They've got this infrastructure in place. They do that stuff out of muscle memory, and it's very easy for them and their dealer network to take care of these sorts of things. Tesla's still building that out. In some states, they're actually just still really getting the whole sales and service operation in place. The other thing is the car itself is still relatively new to the market, so they're still working bugs out. Common complaints were things like scratches, space between body panels. This all comes down to basic craftsmanship of building a car. That's improving, but when models are new, you often have these issues. And there are many of the newer vehicles out there that have a lot of those problems, and they're just kind of catching up to the fact that they're becoming a regular car company now.
Well, and it's interesting that this is on the rise because as you've covered all of the auto sectors, how much of this is our training wheels are on, it's a new company, and how much of this is an expectation that these kinks will be working out eventually?
There's always an expectation issue, and look, Tesla has a bit of an advantage here in that whenever they've had quality issues, there's been a lot more tolerance from their customers because Tesla owners tend to be very delighted with their cars. They like the electric drive, it's very fast. They like the big touch screens and the over-the-air updates and the technology in the vehicle. So they're pretty forgiving when there are small glitches and snafus that come down to quality. So there is an issue where there's an expectation that it'll be great, but their customers tend to be pretty tolerant. But I think it's still just an issue of building up the infrastructure they need to get parts out in the field and get enough people to fix them.
Well, and David, as we know with Tesla, it's all about the battery. And there were some interesting quotes in the survey. Someone said that charging my Tesla at home means I never have to think about it. And then other people complained that there weren't enough superchargers nearby, even though those had been promised. What's the take on the battery?
So the battery itself, people have not had problems so much with the battery and the electric drive system. By far more of the complaints were those craftsmanship issues. The real complaint when it comes to charging, though, is people out in the field who need, or I should say out on the road, who need a supercharger that they can get access to wherever they are. And this is true for all electric vehicles, really. The whole world of supercharging is kind of building itself out as we see more vehicles, more electric cars purchased across the country. So the field of chargers seems to always be a little bit behind the actual population of electric cars out there, and I think that's probably true with Tesla, at least according to the survey it is, because people are happy when they can charge the car at home and not worry about it. But for some of the people who are putting more miles on the car and they need to charge when they're out there, there isn't a filling station or there isn't an electric charger like there's a filling station on every corner, so they need to wait for one, or it's just not where they're going, and it makes things a little more difficult.
Well, and we await part 3 of this amazing survey of about 5,000 owners of this, which comes out Tuesday, November 5th, all about autopilot. Thank you. That was Bloomberg's David Welch. And coming up, raging fires, blackouts, superstorms, and more. All of the threats to the power grids that keep the world going. How AI might be the solution to staying charged. That's next. This is Bloomberg. California power companies say the blackouts they've been imposing to limit wildfires will mostly wrap up by Friday. In the northern part of California, PG&E restored power to nearly 330,000 customers. But extreme weather events can leave people without access to cell networks and the internet. According to the FCC, 17% of cell towers in Sonoma County were down on Wednesday. So what can be done to preserve utility grids from the effects of climate change? Our next guest is working on that very question. It is Phillip, and she is the project leader for Grid Resilience and Intelligence Platform, aka GRIP, over at Stanford University. And GRIP is using AI to redistribute power to necessary systems during, say, a superstorm. So Ashley, great to have you. And you were talking about how you were finally in year 2 of 3 of this project.
Yes.
Over that time period, what have been some of these major challenges that we're confronting?
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, wildfires, here on the West Coast have become pretty regular, just like the seasons, and same thing on the East Coast. We're having regular hurricanes that are increasing in power. And we have to learn how to deal with these. How can we have a more flexible, adaptable grid? The grid infrastructure is some of the oldest legacy infrastructure that we've had in the U.S. And so trying to figure out ways to essentially have new tools and solutions in our toolbox, like AI, like machine learning, that can help anticipate, absorb, and recover from some of these grid events. And that's what we're trying to do with GRIP.
So walk me through some of the solutions that you found so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we look at wildfires, we look at ice storms in Vermont, wildfires here on the West Coast, and we're looking at things like predictive analytics. So how can we look at actually figuring out where crews should be placed in advance of a wind event? In our absorption use case, we're trying to use a method called virtual islanding that actually uses machine learning to figure out how can we do power balancing with water heaters, electric vehicles, solar inverters that actually allows us to have a more flexible grid to absorb these events.
I love that you talked about solar inverters, because we've talked a lot about, when you shut off the power, you can have a solar panel, except that the solar panel run on batteries, and the batteries are $10,000, and they're also connected to the grid. When do we start to see some of the solar power become a real solution instead of also tied to the grid?
Yeah, absolutely. So really with this virtual islanding and microgrids, we're trying to really capture value from distributed energy resources and being able to, as well, being connected to the main source of the grid, but also being able, in times of outages and all these kinds of grid events, being able to still have the lights on and keep mission critical appliances running. So you can think in cases of hospitals, for example, schools, nursing homes. You want to be able to utilize batteries, solar inverters, even electric vehicles potentially. And so there's a lot of opportunities to tap into these new kinds of solutions.
How much of this, I'm thinking of Edison or PG&E, where they don't have access to the technological upgrades, or maybe upgrading the infrastructure is too expensive. How much of that is also coming into a play here?
Absolutely. So actually with GRIP, we have 12 different utilities and co-ops who are technical advisory members to this project, because exactly they are so interested in the work that we're doing, and they realize that they need to integrate some of these solutions into their business plan. And so they're trying to also learn, as we're doing this research and developing these tools and solutions, how they can integrate that and utilize this as well.
This is a technology show, so pretty much every day I hear the word AI being thrown around. How are you using AI to help?
Yeah, absolutely. So a perfect example is using image recognition. So a lot of utilities and co-ops are using drones and using convolutional neural nets to actually be able to run the wires, take photos of distribution poles, and identify, are they tilting one way? Is there vegetation growth? Could that be a fire hazard? And being able to monitor that in addition to human crews. And so being able to create more efficiency and address some of the planning and coordination issues that are currently faced.
If that is not a PhD student, I don't know what is. Ashley Phillip of GRIP, thank you so much for joining. And still ahead, Facebook is doubling down on its decision not to ban political ads despite criticisms. We hear from Facebook's COO, Sheryl Sandberg. She's next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Taylor Riggs, and for Emily Chang in San Francisco. Now, Facebook has seen its share of recent rain clouds with antitrust issues, cryptocurrency pushback, and data breaches hanging over its head. One of the most controversial stances was recently announced by CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who said Facebook will not ban political ads, even those that are known to be false. In an exclusive interview after the company posted earnings on Wednesday, Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde got perspective from Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg.
We're not doing it because of the money. This is less than 1% of our revenue, and the revenue is not worth the controversy. But what Mark said is that we believe in free expression. We believe in political speech, and ads can be an important part of that. Where we're really focused, and I think we are leading, is on transparency. We put out an ad library. We now announced a presidential ads tracker, which means that you can see any ad anyone is running who's a political candidate anywhere in the U.S., anywhere in the world, even if it's not targeted at you. And that kind of transparency we think is really important to people understanding. You also talked about investing in protection. One of the things we talked about on our earnings call just now is the size of the investments we're making, prepared for 2020, working with election commissions all over the world, hiring engineers, using machine, using human reviewers, really doing what we can to make sure people are kept safe.
So when Twitter decides to go the opposite direction, does that make you question your own decision, or you still stand by the fundamental reasoning and transparency that you can bring?
Well, Mark has said on the call that, we've thought about this for years, and certainly we've been thinking about it now. And we fundamentally believe that political ads are an important part of the dialogue and can be important against incumbents, can be important for new views. But we also believe that free expression across the board is something that we stand for as a company. And people all over the world are using that. Certainly politicians are using that. But people are using it, and that's how you see our growth continuing.
Let's talk more a little bit about politicians, because it's going to be a tough year in terms of regulatory scrutiny. Do you worry about talk of the business model being under attack? How do you see your role in educating, particularly those on Capitol Hill, about this?
Well, I think we really have to help people understand that targeted ads and privacy are not at odds. We can do both. So if you're an advertiser, you're the biggest company in the world or the smallest company, and we have 7 million advertisers, 140 million businesses using our services, and you want to show an ad to, women in their 50s, that's me, who live in California, we take the ad, we show it to that person, we give you back aggregated results. We can do very good ads targeting that really makes ads good for people and really helps advertisers reach the right person without violating privacy. And that's something I think we need to do a much better job of explaining.
That was Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg. Now, more on Facebook and that antitrust scrutiny. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is defending the company's acquisition of Instagram back in 2012, which critics say Facebook did to eliminate emerging rivals. To discuss, I am joined here by Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner. When that headline came out, it said Instagram was the focus of antitrust probes. Is that what he's hearing from regulators?
It must be, because he kind of volunteered that information a little bit on the earnings call yesterday, talked about the acquisition of Instagram and how that's going to be discussed a lot, it sounds like, in the near future. And he brought up, to your point, their view on this, which is that it was not a direct competitor, it was more complementary to what they were building. He didn't see it as directly competing with Newsfeed at that time, and it's kind of a valid argument, because Instagram at the time was very small, and so now Facebook is trying to paint a picture that Instagram only became, the behemoth Instagram that we know today because of Facebook's help. And we will never know the actual answer to what Instagram could have become on its own, but I think that's going to be their pitch, that's going to be their framing of this moving forward.
And do we have any indication of the breakdown? We talk about Instagram's strength relative to Facebook, but the dominance, the antitrust scrutiny around eyeballs, around advertising, and how much, sort of what would happen if you split those two apart?
It's hard to even fathom, because most of Instagram's business is built on Facebook technology. So if you're an advertiser, you go in and you buy an ad on Facebook, you're using the same platform, you're using the same technology to send and purchase those ads on Instagram too. So in some ways, Instagram would, in theory, have to build that all from scratch if they were to be broken up. At the same time, they have the audience there. People already know, advertisers already understand the appeal of Instagram, so it wouldn't have to do a lot of selling in that regard, but it would create a very technical challenge of, if you were to split them up, how would that work, because they use the same infrastructure.
We just heard from Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, and she was continuing to defend their rule, along with the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, about doing political ads, regardless of if they're true or not. What's your take?
Well, I actually wrote a few weeks ago that I think Facebook should do away with political ads, simply for the headache. I mean, she mentioned these are not a big part of Facebook's business. I think it's less than 1% of revenue. And think of all the drama that they've now had to deal with in just the last few weeks. And we're still a year away from the actual election. So my argument at the time, I wrote this thing for Business Week that basically just said it's not worth the headache for that 1% of revenue. And I think Twitter kind of proved that point yesterday when they came out and said, we're going to get rid of political ads. And it's a very small part of their business too. And I think they just simply decided it's not worth dealing with all of this if we're not even going to make money from it.
Well, and like you said, I wonder how much of a distraction this is, because then we're also getting news that Zuckerberg's going to be meeting with civil rights groups to talk about their political ad worries, including Al Sharpton next week, of course, here in California. Having to go and meet with all these leaders, it can help, but also how much of a distraction is it?
Well, when I saw Twitter's news yesterday, the first thing I thought was, wow, this is really terrible for Facebook. I didn't actually really even think about it quite as much in the lens of just Twitter exclusively. And the reason is because they're adding so much additional pressure. Now, every single person who's out there thinking that Facebook's policy is wrong can point to Twitter and say, well, they're doing this. Why can't you do that? And so you mentioned Al Sharpton. Hillary Clinton was tweeting about this. A number of other politicians yesterday kind of took Jack Dorsey's tweet and spread it out and said, okay, Facebook, it's your turn next. And I think that pressure is really the biggest issue here.
Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner, thank you for joining. And coming up, it is one of those central figures to emerge from the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, Brittany Kaiser. She spoke to us about personal data and her new mission. That's next. This is Bloomberg. As we mentioned earlier, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey made waves on Wednesday for taking political ads off of Twitter. On that same day, he also made some moves in the blockchain world. Dorsey was one of a few investors in CoinList's $10 million funding round. To discuss, I get CoinList president and co-founder Andy Bromberg. He was also speaking at the San Francisco Blockchain Week on Thursday. $10 million led by Jack Dorsey. What are you doing with the money?
So we are building an exchange. This is called CoinList Trade. We've historically run token sales. We've done primary offerings for new token projects. And today we're taking that and expanding it into secondary trading too. The crypto ecosystem is unusual. Historically, when you've run these primary sales, you've gotten these tokens afterwards. You need to move them to an exchange to trade them afterwards. Imagine if you bought shares in an IPO and you had to move them onto an exchange to trade them after and go through a whole process there. It doesn't make any sense. We're changing that. We're taking sales that we've run the primary for, putting them on the secondary exchange, letting people trade them really easily.
I was chuckling a little bit because you said you are compliant. In this world, what does compliant mean?
Compliant means a lot of things, and there are a lot of agencies that have a stake in these matters. The SEC, the CFTC, FINRA, FinCEN, all these different agencies are looking at the space, and you have to make sure you're abiding by whatever regulations there are. The CoinList Trade Exchange will be trading cryptocurrencies, non-securities assets. And so we have to be compliant with whatever regulators are looking at that. In many cases, it's the CFTC, it's FinCEN, and we look at what they're doing and have to be really careful around those issues.
You know, when we talk about being compliant, I would be remiss not to bring up Libra, and they said that they would not launch until they had, quote, regulatory approval. What are your thoughts on Libra?
You know, Libra, I think, is a great thing for the industry. Facebook has more reach than almost anyone else in the world, and they are going to expose a lot of consumers to the idea of cryptocurrency. Once that happens, it's an open market, and people will compete for market share with Libra. You know, I think there are upsides and downsides to the details of Libra's design, but at the end of the day, they will expose a lot of people to this industry. That's something we are really excited about.
But how is that regulatory environment? Because you talk about how you've been working with your specific regulators to get compliance. Libra clearly has struggled to get people on board. How has the regulatory environment shifted?
Well, I think one big piece you have to look at there is that Facebook is not looked at kindly in DC right now for a variety of reasons, privacy issues included, and a lot of that is tainting the discussion around Libra. Some of the pushback they're getting is not actually specific to the Libra project. It's more about the issues that Facebook has had historically and how that might impact it. But there is some good news, and this has gone largely unnoticed. In the past couple weeks, Commissioner Hester Peirce from the SEC has started to talk about in public speeches in Chicago and Singapore and today in San Francisco about the idea of a safe harbor for crypto tokens. The idea that you might actually be able to carve out certain crypto tokens with certain attributes from securities law and allow them to be traded and issued more freely. That's something really exciting. We are far from conclusion on that, but she's at least talking about it and moving it forward.
And so you think by the fact that we're just talking about it more, despite some of the negative headlines out of Libra, it's good for the industry because more people are talking about it?
I think at the end of the day, they will find a way to launch Libra. There may be some hurdles they have to get over, some unexpected speed bumps, but they will launch it, it will ship, it will reach millions, maybe even more people, and that will be a good thing for crypto as a whole.
So a funding environment, a private company. We talk a lot about private companies, particularly WeWork, and how they have just changed the funding environment and private valuations at this moment. How was the funding environment now more difficult than, let's say, a year or 2 years ago?
There's a lot more scrutiny around business models. I think for a long time we were living in this ecosystem of growth at all costs. And if you could grow, you could raise money. Today, especially in light of the WeWork news over the past couple of months, investors are looking at business models. Can you actually make money with this business? And it's something we've been really focused on because the crypto industry, more than any other industry out there, goes up and down. It has crypto winter, it has crypto spring, and you have to be able to survive that. So for us, being able to build a real business that has a real business model, generates real revenue, has been incredibly important for building ourselves.
And did your investors this time around really want to see that path to profitability more so than 2 years ago?
You know, I think for the most part, Polychain, who led the round, was already an investor in us. Jack certainly looked at this, but we had a lot of existing investors that had seen us do that from the very beginning, and that's why they re-upped their stake and got involved.
Andy Bromberg of CoinList, thank you for joining. And the Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal of 2018 raised our alarm about data privacy. And now Brittany Kaiser, she's the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, has a new role and mission. Our own Caroline Hyde sat down with Kaiser to discuss the controversy around personal data at the Sooner Than You Think event in New York.
So since becoming a whistleblower, I have sought to explain to people exactly how important their data is. Data is now the most valuable asset on planet Earth, more valuable than oil and gas. And on a day-to-day basis, this is being taken from you by companies all around the world that are making a multi-trillion-dollar industry off of your most private information. Now, that sounds a little gloom and doom when people think that they can't get their privacy back, but the truth is people have agency. There's a lot of things that we can do on a day-to-day basis to protect ourselves, and legislators and regulators are finally listening. There are fantastic laws that have been introduced to U.S. Congress and across different states that not only could protect us ahead of the next election, but could make sure that we live a more ethical digital life from here forward.
So what sort of legislation do you think sets the highest standard at the moment? We've seen California pass privacy laws. You know, you're working with Wyoming, but GDPR is something that Facebook itself has pointed towards in Europe as potentially being some sort of blueprint. Where do you think legislation is leading the way?
So I think with GDPR, the most important part of it is that it recognizes that your data is your property, and therefore you have the right to transparency. Who's collecting data on you? What do they hold? And what are they using it for? And if they want to continue to use it, you need to opt into that. Transparency and consent is the most important part of this conversation, which is why I'm really excited that the state of California has implemented a version of GDPR. That is going to come into effect in January. Also, Governor Gavin Newsom in the state of California has introduced something called the Data Dividend Law, which means that not only do companies need to tell you what they hold on you, but how much money they're making off your data and give you a cut of that. There's also national legislation put forth by Senators Ed Markey, the consent bill, that means that we have to opt in as a nation. Right now, everyone in America is pre-opted in to your data being collected, which is the opposite in Europe. You're pre-opted out, and you have to actually consent, right? Now, also Senator Mark Warner has an entire package of legislation that demands everything from transparency and consent to how your data is collected to banning negative use cases of your data and malicious use cases of algorithms that push kind of hatred and vitriol to the top of your news feed on social media.
It's interesting that at the same time as legislation is being enacted, we're also seeing the companies themselves react in many ways. Facebook announcing that they are having more third-party fact-checking, they are employing more people, the amount that they're spending on security, the fact that we now see Google moving to protect children more with YouTube Kids. What do you think about the steps being taken by the companies themselves and whether they go far enough?
I think that the investment that Facebook is currently making into stopping foreign intervention in our elections is incredibly important and direly needed. Unfortunately, we didn't have those protections in 2015 and 2016. Unfortunately, what Facebook is not recognizing is that the greatest threats to democracy are domestic. To our politicians being allowed to say whatever they want in their political advertising. I think that decision a few weeks ago to not give the same community standards that you and I have to abide to politicians is not only a massive threat, but will continue the problems that we saw in 2016, where everything from incitement of violence, racial hatred, sexism, and voter suppression tactics were used by the Trump campaign and the Trump super PAC and aided by Facebook.
The fact that Facebook's own employees, some of them, have written a letter about this very nature, do you think that that might force some change? Do you expect that to have to be changed within the company, do you think?
I do expect that demanding change is the only way that we're going to get anywhere, whether it's Facebook employees or regular citizens. I tell people every single day, call your legislator. Sometimes I meet with legislators and regulators, and they say they have never heard from a single constituent that they care about data rights, they care about data protection, and that is a big problem, because if we in droves are asking our legislators, they are legally required to do something about it.
That was Digital Asset Trade Association co-founder and former Cambridge Analytica director, Brittany Kaiser. And still ahead, Facebook revenue growth contributed to a solid third quarter earnings, not impacting the report, regulation, and Libra. For now, we talked to RBC analyst Mark Mahaney about the numbers next. This is Bloomberg. Now let's get back to the top story of the day. It is all about Facebook's third quarter report, and it was well received by analysts, helping squash some investor concerns about the impact of ongoing negative publicity and lawmaker attention to its platform. But that doesn't mean that regulation woes and crypto doubts won't hurt earnings eventually. Mark Mahaney of RBC Capital joins me now. Mark, how, as an analyst, in all your years of covering this, how surprised are you that Mark Zuckerberg came out and really, for a lot of the portion, was defending his political ad position?
Well, he owns the company, essentially, and he acts like he owns the company, and he's been strongly opinionated from the beginning, and I respect him for that. If you're owning Facebook stock, you are in part making a bet on Mark Zuckerberg and how well he's handled the company, how responsible he's going to be through these crisis moments. Every company has them. This company has had crisis moments. A year ago was Cambridge Analytica. There could be another crisis moment in terms of this next election if there's some belief that if there's a rumor that starts about there being manipulation. So you're in part making a bet on just how dependable he is going to be going through this. I think he has a pretty good track record.
Then Twitter came out, notably at the same time of their earnings, and took an opposite position. Who's right, Facebook or Twitter?
Okay, so the divide here is whether or not you should allow political advertising on the network. And I got to say, I much prefer the point of view of Zuckerberg than Twitter, than Dorsey. Zuckerberg versus Dorsey. I'll take Zuckerberg on this. His point was, why don't we show the political ads? It doesn't really matter in terms of the numbers, the revenue number to Facebook. It's 0.5% of their revenue. Let's show the political ads, but let's have complete transparency over it. Are there some political ads that are probably in poor taste? Absolutely. They're called attack ads. We've lived with them for decades. Can they be on Facebook? Why not? Let's make it really clear, though, who is spending the money on those ads. And if Senator Warren or President Trump or somebody who supports those sides or candidate Biden, let's find out who is throwing out really bad, unfair ads. But as long as there's some great disclosure at the bottom, and by the way, I think that can be improved. In the past, we always at the end of the TV ad, you would hear sponsored by or paid for by. I'm sure there's a way we can take that ad creative that's on the internet, make it damn obvious that it's a political ad and it's paid by, and here it is. So we can all go fact check it ourselves.
If anyone can do margin analysis, it's you. They had beat on the operating income, the margins, and the bottom line. Are you worried then that they aren't spending enough to clean up the platform?
I think that's such a great question. I think most people go the other way and they think about it's great they're not spending enough. This company, I think there's two good pieces of news here. They're still expending aggressively next year. They're going to grow their CapEx about 15% and their operating expenses about 30%, 35%. That's what's in their guidance. That's good growth. That's what you want to see long-lasting tech franchises do. That's what Amazon's done to get to where it is today. That's what Google has done. You also found out, though, that level of spend is decelerating a little bit from where it was last year. Like 2019 was a big spend year for good reasons for Facebook. It seems to us like they've done a pretty good job in improving the stability and the durability of the platform.
We also, I think, got a little bit of an indication of where regulators are focused. The company came out and said Instagram has been an area of focus now in terms of the antitrust issues. Do we now have a clearer picture where these antitrust issues are headed?
Not really. It's unfortunate. No, I think the answer is there's sort of three areas of regulation. There's taxes, privacy, and then monopolistic anti-competitive practices. The Instagram acquisition was approved. I think it's very hard to look back on that and say that wasn't an asset that was tiny at the time, that had some nice synergies that developed with core Facebook. Breaking up Facebook and forcing them to spin off Instagram, I don't know on what ground grounds you would do that? And for shareholders, I think it'd probably be a negative event. I don't think there's a great I don't think that's a positive catalyst.
You like the stock. What's the biggest headwind as we enter 2020?
I think there are 2 or 3 of them. I think probably at the top of the list, though, is what you've kind of been leading with, which is regulatory risk. And then maybe a little bit of competition risk. And we haven't seen it show up in the numbers, but there's a really popular new social media site out there called TikTok that seems to be sweeping the area, especially in terms of the really young demographic. So it's possible that that could start clipping some of the growth, maybe not of core Facebook, but of Instagram and maybe Snapchat too.
And you see at 191 a share or so, we're not near record high levels yet of a 205. What do you see that could take the stock to that next leg higher? Do we have to remove that regulatory overhang to get us to move higher?
Probably, or you need to have some new revenue streams tap in next year. I think this is the most attractively priced on a growth-adjusted basis, large-cap internet stocks, and maybe tech stocks too. It's rare that companies trade at a discount to their growth rate. I think Facebook is a 20-25% earnings grower, trading at less than 20 times earnings. That to me means that you can, it's kind of a double-barreled stock. What I mean by that is the stock will go up on the multiple going up and on positive earnings revisions. You don't normally get that. When you get it, you should be aggressive on a stock. We are.
With discount rate and growth rates, you're giving me another education on the little r and the little g. So thank you. That was Mark Mahaney of RBC Capital. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.